Usually when we talk about human memory, there's this expectation of precision, like a video recorder.
Right, yeah, like you just press a button.
Exactly. You experience an event, your brain hits record, and when you want to remember it, you just hit play and watch it back perfectly.
Well, it's a comforting binary, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
the event happened or it didn't happen. We desperately want our own personal histories to be factual.
Yeah, to sit neatly in a categorized box of absolute truth.
But the reality is much messier, especially when you step into the world of trauma or, deep, unspeakable guilt.
Right, suddenly that video recorder is just shattered. We're looking at a mental landscape that is, well, honestly, it's incredibly murky.
It is the absolute definition of psychological muddy waters.
Yeah.
And the harder you try to look through it, the more the reflections distort.
And that muddy water is exactly what we are navigating today. We've got our hands on an incredibly detailed, exhaustive, 15-part masterclass syllabus.
Oh, it is massive.
It really is. It analyzes the complete works of the 2017 Nobel laureate Kazuo Ishiguro.
So, okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
Our mission today isn't just to give you like a standard book report on a stack of famous novels. We are tracking the evolution of a brilliant, highly unusual mind.
Yeah, we're going to explore how human beings, and frankly, entire societies, use self-delusion, selective memory, and even just polite everyday language to shield themselves.
They shield themselves from historical guilt and personal trauma. Right.
Exactly. And what's fascinating here is the origin of that brilliant mind. Kazuo Ishiguro occupies a totally unique, almost liminal space in literature.
Because of his background, right.
Right. He was born in Nagasaki, Japan in 1954, which is, less than a decade after the atomic bomb obliterated the city.
Wow, that's really close to the event.
It is. But his family moved to Guildford, England when he was just 5 years old. So for the young Ishiguro growing up in the 1960s, Japan wasn't a physical reality he interacted with daily.
He couldn't just pull up a street view on the internet back then. No, not at all. His Japan was an artifact. It was a purely imaginary space preserved in his mind through manga magazines and films sent by his grandparents overseas.
So he's literally building his own memory palace out of imported pop culture and family lore?
Yeah, all while growing up in a Britain that was simultaneously dismantling its global empire and grappling with the existential anxieties of the Cold War.
That is a wild mix of influences.
It really is. And that dual identity created a writer who blends two very distinct traditions. On one hand, you have Eastern cinematic pacing.
Which the syllabus talks about, right?
Right, specifically the concept of mono. This is often translated as the beautiful, sad transience of things, which was heavily influenced by the Japanese filmmaker Yasujiro Ozu.
I love that concept.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, he merges that with deeply Western psychological realism, so it echoes the dense internal monologues of writers like Henry James or Marcel Proust.
So it's not just a blending of cultures, it's a blending of internal processing. You have the quiet, fleeting sorrow of a cherry blossom falling, mashed up against the suffocating, neurotic overthinking of a Victorian parlor room.
That is a perfect way to describe it.
And that gives us the perfect roadmap for our deep dive today. We're going to track this trajectory starting in the quiet, post-war ruins of domestic tragedies.
And from there, we'll slide into surreal, dreamlike cityscapes, plunge into historical war zones.
I'll wander through medieval fantasy fogs and eventually end up in futuristic dystopian science fiction.
By the end of this, we'll see exactly how Ishiguro mastered the art of what the Swedish Academy called the translatable novel.
He starts by looking backward at the wreckage of mid-century history, right?
Yeah, and slowly turns his gaze forward, ultimately becoming a prophet of human value in an age of intense technological alienation.
So let's start where Ishiguro started. The immediate aftermath of World War II and the invention of his signature literary device.
The Ishiguro narrator.
Yes, the Ishiguro narrator. This is a voice that fundamentally lies to itself just to survive. We see this vividly in his 1982 debut novel, A Pale View of Hills.
The syllabus highlights this book as the foundational blueprint for everything he does later. The novel opens in the bleak, gray English countryside.
Setting the mood early.
Always. We meet Itsuko, an aging Japanese widow living alone. She is reeling from a present-day tragedy. Her eldest daughter, Keiko, has recently committed suicide by hanging herself in a rented room in Manchester.
Itsuko had brought her over from Japan after marrying an Englishman, right?
Correct. And it's an unimaginable level of grief. Normally, in a traditional novel, The protagonist would spend the book weeping, looking at old photographs, and directly wrestling with the suicide.
But Etsuko's mind does something completely evasive. She enters a bizarre memory loop. She casts her mind back to the early 1950s, to a devastated, rebuilding post-war Nagasaki.
And notice what she focuses on in Nagasaki. She doesn't reflect deeply on her own life, even though she was pregnant with Keiko at the time.
And she was married to a very traditional, chauvinistic husband named Jiro.
Yeah, she barely mentions him. Instead, she obsessively recalls her friendship with a woman named Sachiko.
Okay, Sachiko is this impoverished, aristocratic woman living in a dilapidated wooden shack near a murky river.
Right, and she's living there with her young, deeply traumatized daughter, Mariko.
Sachiko is desperately trying to escape the poverty of post-war Japan, so she's clinging to an untrustworthy, drunk American soldier named Frank.
And in doing so, Etsuko just stands by and watches as Sachiko repeatedly neglects her daughter's safety.
The neglect reaches a point of absolute horror.
It really does. To sever her ties to Japan and force the move with the American soldier, Sachiko brutally drowns Mariko's pet kittens in the river.
Oh, man. Right in front of the child, too.
Yes, it's a scene of visceral, unforgettable cruelty.
All while there are these terrifying rumors circulating in the background of the city about a mysterious woman drowning babies in the area.
And little Mariko keeps claiming she sees this strange woman across the river at night.
It has this chilling, gothic, ghost story vibe. It feels almost supernatural, but the real horror is entirely psychological.
Exactly. And this brings us to the thematic core of the novel Maternal Guilt and the unspoken trauma of the atomic bomb.
What the syllabus points out as brilliant is how the bomb itself is almost never explicitly discussed.
Nagasaki is a landscape of ghosts, of flattened buildings and fractured families. But the trauma is pushed down beneath polite conversation.
And Etsuko cannot articulate her own crushing maternal guilt. Deep down, she believes that by uprooting Keiko from Japan to England, she caused her daughter's alienation and ultimate suicide.
But because the human ego would completely shatter under that realization, Ishiguro employs a technique we can call narrative superimposition.
I love that term. How does narrative superimposition actually work in her brain, practically speaking?
Etsuko's mind creates a psychological double. She displaces her own trauma onto the figure of Sachiko.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, so every harsh criticism Etsuko levies against Sachiko's terrible parenting in her memories is actually a self-flagellating trial of her own historical choices.
She is essentially putting herself on trial in her own mind, but using a proxy defendant so she doesn't have to face the direct pain.
Exactly. And the text never announces this deceit. There's no chapter where Etsuko says, oh, by the way, I was actually talking about myself.
But at the very end of the novel, there is a terrifying narrative slip, right?
Yes. Etsuko is talking to her younger, westernized daughter, Nikki, in the present day. They're talking about the past. And Etsuko suddenly says something really jarring.
She says, Keiko was happy that day. We brought her out to the hills. I remember we used a rope for the swing.
Right. She accidentally swaps Mariko's name for Keiko's.
And she specifically mentions a rope, which is the very instrument of Keiko's later suicide in Manchester.
It reveals that the entire story of Sachiko and Mariko by the river might have been a complete psychological projection.
This two photographic negatives placed over one another, blurring the lines of who actually did what. It's chilling.
It reminds me of a corrupted computer file. You know when a vital system file gets corrupted?
Yeah, and the system freaks out.
Right. And to prevent the entire operating system from permanently crashing and deleting itself, the computer instinctively renames the file and hides it in a background folder.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
It doesn't fix the corruption. It just quarantines it so the machine can keep running. Etsuko's brain is doing exactly that. It's renaming Keiko to Mariko just to keep Etsuko's biological machine functioning day to day.
A very precise way to look at it. The brain is performing emergency triage on its own memories, and Ishiguro takes this mechanism of self-defense even further in his next book.
Which is An Artist of the Floating World, published in 1986.
Right. If Etsuko represents the domestic internal guilt of a mother, this novel scales that up to the sweeping political complicity of an entire nation.
So we meet Masuji Ono. He's an aging retired painter living in an unnamed Japanese city somewhere between 1948 and 1950. He's living in this grand, slightly decaying villa, spending his days trying to arrange a marriage, a traditional miai, for his younger daughter, Noriko.
But there is an intense, suffocating paranoia running through the whole process.
Because a previous marriage negotiation for Noriko mysteriously collapsed at the last minute.
And Ono is convinced that the prospective groom's family is hiring private detectives to investigate his past.
And, well, his past is a minefield. As the narrative winds back to the 1920s and 30s, we learn that as a young man, Ono trained under a master who painted the floating world, the ukiyo.
That was the transient, beautiful night world of geishas, lantern-lit bars, and fleeting sensory pleasures. It was art for art's sake.
But as Japan entered a phase of fierce militarism, extreme poverty, and economic hardship, Ono rejected that decadent art.
He was influenced by a charismatic right-wing nationalist, right?
He was. Ono began creating fierce, striking propaganda art, advocating for Japanese imperial expansion. He became a celebrated figure of the regime.
He even acted as an official cultural inquisitor. He eventually betrayed his own favorite student to the ideological police for creating unpatriotic art.
Fast forward to the post-war present, and Ono's world is completely flipped upside down. Japan is occupied by American forces. Ono's wife and son are dead because of the war.
And the younger generation, including his own daughters, looks at elders like Ono not with traditional reverence, but with bitter, barely concealed resentment.
Overnight, everything he considered a lifetime achievement has transformed into a badge of shame.
The theme here is the complicity of art in fascism and the painful, almost impossible collapse of a worldview.
Ono genuinely believed his propaganda was helping the impoverished classes and restoring national dignity.
Ishiguro is exposing a very uncomfortable truth here. Monstrous political movements are rarely fueled entirely by cartoonish villains.
Yeah, they're often propelled by idealistic individuals who fervently believe they are doing good, using their talents to serve what they think is a noble cause.
And how Ono deals with this sudden irrelevance is the real magic trick of the book. He doesn't just lie and say, I never painted those posters, or I was secretly against the war.
Right. He uses what the syllabus calls the mask of politeness.
It's so subtle.
This is where we see Ishiguro's technical genius really solidify. Ono is a highly sophisticated performative narrator. He uses hyper-polite qualifiers as an armor to protect his ego.
He constantly narrates his memories with phrases like, no doubt I am misremembering, or I may be doing him an injustice.
He continuously modulates the scale of his own importance.
He's trapped in this paradox where he wants to acknowledge his past so people still think he was a big deal, while simultaneously downplaying the negative consequences of that past.
He desperately clings to the belief that his mistakes were at least grand, historical, and meaningful, rather than just petty and forgotten.
Exactly the tension Ishiguro wants us to feel. Ono would rather be remembered as a magnificent, influential villain than an irrelevant, forgotten old man who backed the wrong horse.
And the extreme politeness is a rhetorical shield. By constantly doubting his own memory in the text, he preemptively disarms the reader's judgment.
Think about how common this is today, just in everyday life or like corporate PR speak. You catch yourself using extreme politeness or shifting blame just to avoid facing a minor failure.
Oh, absolutely.
Instead of saying, I completely neglected my responsibilities, someone will say, there may have been a slight miscommunication regarding the deliverables on my end.
We use formal, polite language to sanitize our own incompetence.
Yeah.
Ono is just doing that on a macro historical scale.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Ishiguro is showing us that geopolitics, empires, and societal norms are actually the most transient floating illusions of all.
They change overnight. The real enduring battleground, the only constant, is inside the human mind, frantically trying to maintain its dignity as the world shifts beneath it.
Dignity. That is the perfect pivot point for us. Because if Ono uses politeness as a shield, our next protagonist turns it into an impenetrable fortress.
Yes. We are moving from the polite self-defense of a Japanese painter to the ultimate, iconic embodiment of emotional containment.
The British Butler. Let's dig into the 1989 masterpiece, The Remains of the Day.
This novel is an absolute autopsy of the British myth of deference.
Yeah.
It's the summer of 1956. We follow Stevens, the aging head butler of Darlington Hall.
He's taking a 6-day motoring journey through the West Country of England in a Ford belonging to his new employer.
A wealthy, breezy American named Mr. Faraday.
And Faraday's presence is so symbolic. He represents this new post-colonial, post-war world order that is literally buying up and casually occupying the grand fading spaces of the old British aristocracy.
Faraday jokes around he wants banter, which completely paralyzes Stevens.
Stevens doesn't know how to banter.
Not at all. Stevens is ostensibly on this road trip because he received a letter from the former housekeeper, Miss Kenton.
He suspects her marriage is failing, and he convinces himself he wants to recruit her back to Darlington Hall to solve a minor staffing shortage.
But as he drives, his mind constantly drifts back to the golden age of the Hall in the 1920s and 30s, under his former master, Lord Darlington.
And through these memories, we see Stevens's absolute fanatical commitment to his definition of dignity. But when you actually look at how he defines dignity, it's horrifying.
It is the total eradication of emotional vulnerability. Stevens believes flawless service means suppressing all personal desires, all opinions, and all grief.
The syllabus highlights a devastating sequence during a crucial 1923 diplomatic conference at the Hall.
Yes, Stevens' own father, who was also a legendary butler, and Stevens' idol, suffers a severe stroke and is dying in a cramped upstairs room.
Any normal human being would drop everything to be at their father's deathbed. But Stevens, he chooses to continue serving port and cigars to the diplomats downstairs.
He refuses to let his grief disrupt the service. And the most heartbreaking part is that he recalls this moment with immense pride.
He views his lack of emotional reaction as his greatest professional triumph.
He literally castrates his own capacity for love and humanity for the sake of the silver polishing schedule. And he does the exact same thing politically.
Through his memories, we realize Lord Darlington wasn't just a polite aristocrat. He was an active pawn for Nazi Germany.
Darlington hosted anti-Semitic meetings, tried to appease Hitler, and eventually ordered Stevens to fire 2 Jewish maids simply because of their religion.
And Miss Kenton, the housekeeper, is furious. She threatens to resign. She begs Stevens to see how evil this is.
But Stevens just blindly executes the order. He claims it's not his place to judge the moral decisions of noble gentlemen.
That is the political blindness of deference. Stevens abdicates his moral agency entirely.
He assumes the ruling elite possess some higher wisdom, which is a lethal assumption. But the technical engine Ishiguro uses to convey this tragic suppression is what makes the book a masterpiece.
The syllabus calls it lexical containment.
Lexical containment, using words as a cage.
Precisely. Stevens filters raw emotion through dense bureaucratic jargon. When his father is dying, he doesn't say to the reader, "I was heartbroken," or "I was terrified."
He described his own mental state as maintaining a professional equilibrium of great consequence.
He uses high-flown formal language to ensure he never actually has to feel the jagged edges of his own pain.
There's that devastating scene where Miss Kenton bursts into Stevens' private pantry. She catches him reading a book, and when she forces him to show her what it is, it turns out to be a sentimental, romantic love story.
He freezes and demands she leave. On the surface, it's just a workplace squabble.
But the subtext is roaring. He reads romance novels to fulfill his starved emotional life. Her intrusion is this incredibly intimate exposure of his private self.
The self capable of love, and he violently slams the door on it.
He slams the door on her and on his own life, which leads to the climax of the book.
After driving across the country, he finally reunites with Miss Kenton in a rain-slicked tea room in Weymouth in 1956.
During their conversation, Miss Kenton admits that her marriage hasn't always been happy. She confesses that she often thinks of the life they could have had together at Darlington Hall.
She realizes she might have wasted her life. And Stevens's internal monologue in that exact moment is, "My heart was breaking."
It's one of the only times his lexical cage cracks.
But externally, what does he actually say to her? He just politely agrees that one cannot turn back the clock.
He offers her no comfort, no confession of his own love. They part ways forever.
It is agonizing.
Yeah.
Later, sitting alone on the pier, watching the lights come on, Stevens finally breaks down.
He confesses to a complete stranger, a retired ticket splitter sitting next to him, his deep shame.
He admits he trusted Lord Darlington, gave him his best years, and has absolutely nothing to show for it. He didn't even make his own mistakes. He just blindly executed someone else's.
But here is where it gets really interesting. Is he actually a victim here?
Right, because looking at this, it seems like he's using his job title as a coward's shield.
He can blame the rigid British class system all he wants. But isn't his extreme professionalism just a convenient excuse so he never has to take the terrifying risk of living a real, messy human life?
That is the brilliant ambiguity Ishiguro creates. And it ties into what the existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre called mauvaise foi, or bad faith.
Bad faith is when you identify so completely with a social role, a waiter, a butler, a soldier, that you cease to exist as a free moral agent.
You pretend you are an object with no choices. Stevens chose the shield because he was terrified of vulnerability.
But the society certainly built the shield and handed it to him, praising him for holding it so tightly.
Think about your own career for a second. We don't have literal butlers and grand estates much anymore, but we absolutely do this today with hustle culture.
Oh, definitely.
How easy is it to let your professional identity, your LinkedIn profile, your relentless busyness entirely consume your human identity?
We use being swamped with work as a socially acceptable excuse to avoid dealing with our failing relationships.
Or our lack of hobbies, or our own emotional emptiness. We maintain our own professional equilibrium so we don't have to look in the mirror.
It's a profound modern parallel. We use our schedules to avoid our souls. And just as Ishiguro perfected that tight, controlled realism to explore this avoidance, he decides to completely shatter the mold for his next phase.
We transition now into the radical shift to dream logic in his 1995 novel, The Unconsoled.
So if Stevens is trapped by the rigid rules of his society, what happens when a character's mind completely rejects those rules?
Ishiguro actually answers this by throwing out the laws of physics and reality altogether. He follows up a universally beloved masterpiece of realism with a polarizing, Kafkaesque 500-page surrealist nightmare.
The Unconsoled is deeply disorienting. We follow Ryder, a world-renowned pianist who arrives in a nameless, labyrinthine European city to give a crucial performance.
The locals inexplicably believe this piano concert will single-handedly heal their deep civic trauma and cultural decline.
But from the second he steps into the hotel lobby, the anxiety starts. He is besieged by impossible demands from everyone he meets.
The hotel porter, Gustav, corners him and wants Ryder to mediate a bitter, years-long dispute with his estranged daughter, Sophie.
And the hotel manager, Hoffman, begs him to look at his wife's scrapbooks to validate her life. Ryder has no memory of his schedule, he's exhausted, but he just agrees to everything.
This maps perfectly onto the psychology of what we call the gifted child neurosis.
Ryder represents the perfectionist who has learned, likely from a very young age, that love and validation are strictly conditional upon flawless public performance.
He has a pathological need to please everyone, stemming from the trauma of his perpetually absent, highly critical parents.
Because he cannot tolerate the idea of disappointing anyone, he cannot say no. As a result, he abandons his actual priorities to appease every random stranger he meets.
And Ishiguro externalizes this panic. The geography of the book literally warps to match Ryder's anxiety.
There's a scene where Ryder is in his hotel room trying to get to a distant part of the city. He walks into a broom closet in his hotel, pushes past some mops, and instantly emerges miles outside the town in a rural cafe.
Or he'll get in a car to drive to a venue, and it takes hours to cross a single ordinary street. It completely defies spatial logic.
It functions exactly like a stress dream. You know the phenomenon you show up to a final college exam you haven't studied for. The classroom is somehow also your childhood bedroom, and you're not wearing pants.
Exactly. And the defining feature of a stress dream isn't just the weirdness. It's the fact that within the dream, you don't question the weirdness.
You just accept the insane logic and try to navigate the panic.
Ryder never stops and says, wait, how did a broom closet lead to the countryside? He just thinks, oh no, I'm going to be late for my meeting.
He applies that exact dream mechanism to a 500-page narrative. The physical landscape is a direct projection of his fractured, overscheduled mind.
The boundaries between the public and private self completely collapse. We even discover midway through the book that Sophie, the hotel porter's daughter, who Ryder's supposed to help, is actually Ryder's own long-term partner.
And her son Boris is his child. Yet, Ryder arrived in the city thinking he was a solitary traveler.
His repression is so total that he has alienated himself from his own family.
And because Ryder's ego is far too fragile to directly confess his childhood trauma or his failures as a father, Ishiguro employs a technique the syllabus identifies as proxy narration.
Right, because if you have a narrator who refuses to talk about his feelings, how does the reader know what he's feeling?
You force the minor characters to act as mirrors. Since Ryder won't speak, the supporting cast speaks his subtext back to him.
When the hotel manager Hoffman corners Ryder and talks endlessly for pages about how his parents never appreciated his musical taste and how he feels fundamentally inadequate.
Hoffman is actually articulating Ryder's own repressed wounds. The minor characters function as ventriloquist dummies for Ryder's subconscious.
It all builds to this catastrophic climax. The big concert that is supposed to save the city is an absolute disaster.
The town's former musical hero, Brodsky, tries to conduct an orchestra despite having just had his leg amputated in a bizarre car accident.
He's propped up on stage, His prosthetic woodblock leg snaps, and it's this grotesque, humiliating display of failure.
And writer. Amidst this chaos, he discovers his parents. The whole reason he built this massive, exhausting global career never even came to the town.
They bypassed him entirely. He breaks down weeping behind the stage curtains. He realizes the hollow core of worldly ambition.
No amount of public applause, no amount of flawless concertos can fill the void of parental neglect. The conditional love he sought was a mirage.
Yet the novel's ending is perhaps the most tragic part. The next morning, Ryder finds himself on a circular tram car.
Instead of having a breakthrough and going back to his partner and son, he convinces himself the disastrous performance was actually a minor success.
He begins looking forward to his next tour date. He is trapped in an infinite loop of performance and denial, riding a tram that physically circles the city forever.
Think about the circular trams in your own life. Are you locked in a cycle of endless obligations, running yourself ragged, trying to perform for a boss or a social circle?
Seeking approval that will never actually heal whatever inner child wound you are carrying? It's a terrifying question because the momentum of that tram is so hard to stop.
The momentum is blinding, and Ishiguro continues to escalate the stakes of this blindness.
As we move forward in the syllabus, we explore how he takes this exploration of collective denial into distinct literary genres.
He tears those genres apart from the inside to expose the historical blood beneath them. We see this vividly in When We Were Orphans from the year 2000 and The Buried Giant from 2015.
Let's start with When We Were Orphans. We meet Christopher Banks, a celebrated, quintessential 1930s London society detective.
He's exactly the kind of character you'd expect to see smoking a pipe in a tweed suit solving drawing room murders.
But he is haunted by a trauma from his childhood in the international settlement of Shanghai. His parents, who were loosely involved in the British opium trade, vanished mysteriously when he was a boy.
Presumably kidnapped by local warlords. Christopher becomes pathologically convinced that if he can just return to Shanghai, apply his brilliant deductive reasoning, and solve this single, decades-old mystery.
He thinks he will somehow avert the impending global catastrophe of World War II.
The syllabus points out that this is the ultimate expression of childhood solipsism, the belief that the entire world revolves around your personal family drama.
He arrives in Shanghai in 1937, right as the horrific, bloody Sino-Japanese War is tearing the city apart, and he treats this literal apocalyptic war zone like a polite Agatha Christie mystery.
He is wandering into the bombed-out ruins of Chapet, surrounded by artillery fire, shrapnel, and civilian corpses, literally looking for clues with a magnifying glass.
It's completely absurd and darkly comedic until it becomes horrifying.
Ishiguro is meticulously deconstructing the myth of the heroic Western individual. Think about the classic detective genre.
It assumes that the world is fundamentally rational, that a single brilliant intellect can solve a crime, punish the guilty, and restore moral order to the universe.
Ishiguro exposes this as a dangerous, childish delusion. The rational tools of Western enlightenment, the magnifying glass, and the deductive logic are entirely useless against the raw, irrational, systemic forces of military violence and total war.
And the climax destroys his entire worldview. He finally uncovers the truth, and it has nothing to do with a grand conspiracy.
His father wasn't kidnapped by political rivals, he just ran off with a mistress. But the truth about his mother is horrific.
She was abducted by a Chinese warlord who kept her as a severely abused concubine for years, specifically to fund Christopher's elite education and life in England.
His entire glamorous London existence, his tweed suits, his high society parties, was bought and paid for with the blood money and sexual slavery of his own mother.
It's a scathing critique of Western colonialism. The clean, orderly lifestyle of the metropole London society is structurally dependent on the unseen, brutal exploitation of the colonies.
The genre of the neat British whodunit literally collapses under the weight of real-world historical atrocity.
Ishiguro mirrors this collapse in the writing itself. The prose starts to stutter and fracture into fragmented, confused sentences as Christopher enters the trenches, mimicking the onset of post-traumatic stress.
It's a devastating realization of privilege. The things keeping us comfortable are often things we refuse to look at.
And Ishiguro tackles this idea of historical blind spots from a completely different angle in The Buried Giant. We move from a 1930s war zone to a post-Arthurian mythic Britain.
We have this elderly couple, Axel and Beatrice, living in a dark dirt burrow in a hillside.
The defining characteristic of this primitive society is a strange, omnipresent psychological fog called the mist of forgetting.
It blankets the entire landscape and causes severe collective amnesia. The villagers cannot even remember events from the previous week, let alone their personal histories.
Axel and Beatrice possess only a faint, lingering feeling that they might have had a son who left their village years ago. So they set off on a journey across the rugged terrain to find him.
Along the way, it feels like a classic fantasy quest. They meet wandering knights, Saxon warriors, monks, and they discover the source of this mist.
It's the breath of an ancient she-dragon named Querig. But the twist is the political reality behind why the dragon is kept alive.
This is where the fantasy tropes are weaponized. We learn that King Arthur, long dead by this point, ordered the sorcerer Merlin to use the dragon to create the mist, specifically to preserve a fragile peace.
The mist prevents the Saxon settlers from remembering that Arthur's Briton knights brutally slaughtered Saxon women and children in a genocidal military campaign years prior.
The magical fog is a state-sponsored cover-up of ethnic cleansing.
Wait, but think about the implications of that. We are constantly taught, from elementary school onward, that those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. It's practically a cultural bumper sticker.
But Ishiguro seems to be throwing that logic out the window. He's asking a terrifying counter-question.
What if remembering history, what if clinging to the exact details of every historical atrocity is exactly what causes us to repeat the violence?
That is the absolute crux of the novel. The characters debate whether to kill the dragon and lift the mist. When the Saxon warrior Wistan finally slays Querig, the mist dissipates.
And what happens? Does it lead to a beautiful moment of truth and reconciliation?
Absolutely not. The historical memories of the genocide flood back into the minds of the locals, and Wistan immediately leaves to rally the Saxon tribes for a bloody, vengeance-fueled war of extermination against the Britons.
The syllabus notes that Ishiguro wrote this with a clear eye on modern historical traumas, the Rwandan genocide, the Balkan Wars following the collapse of Yugoslavia.
He addresses the terrifying, pragmatic reality that peace is often built directly on top of a mass grave of forgotten grievances.
And what blows my mind is how he scales that massive geopolitical question down to the intimate domestic level. Axel and Beatrice's private memories return, too.
They don't just remember their love. They remember past infidelities, bitter arguments, periods of intense cruelty toward one another.
Beatrice is dying, and at the end of the novel, they reach the water, and the mysterious boatman separates them to cross to an island.
Axel realizes their love, though real and enduring, wasn't perfect, and it ultimately can't conquer death or the resentments of the past.
It forces us to ask if their marriage only survived its later years because they literally couldn't remember why they were mad at each other.
Think about your own relationships for a second. We idealize total transparency, but do we actually want total brutal honesty all the time?
Or is a healthy dose of mutual forgetting actively letting go of old slights, pretending we don't remember that hurtful thing our partner said 5 years ago, the actual secret to survival?
Maybe we all need a little mist of forgetting in our living rooms just to stay married. It's a stark, minimalist parable.
Ishiguro uses Tolkien-esque high fantasy tropes, dragons, knights, magic, ogres, but strips them of all their traditional glamour.
The combat isn't heroic. It's clumsy and brutal. The knights are arthritic, cynical, and deeply traumatized.
He prevents the reader from experiencing the book as escapist fiction, forcing us instead to examine the mechanics of memory, tribal hatred, and the fragility of love.
We've looked at the past, we've looked at the mythic fog of memory. Now we shift our focus forward.
We are diving into Ishiguro's futuristic allegories, where the horrors are driven not by dragons or warlords, but by medical and technological progress. Let's explore Never Let Me Go and Clara and the Sun.
Never Let Me Go, published in 2005, is an international cultural phenomenon, and for good reason. It is a masterpiece of dread.
We follow three main characters, Kathy, Tommy, and Ruth. They grow up at Hailsham, which appears to be an idyllic, progressive English boarding school set in the late 1990s.
The teachers, known as guardians, highly encourage the students to create high-quality art, painting, and poetry, which is collected in a mysterious gallery.
On the surface, it sounds like a lovely arts academy. But slowly, through casual hints, strange health protocols, and euphemisms, the horrifying truth of their existence emerges.
They are clones. They were created in a laboratory, devoid of parents, to serve as medical livestock for normal humans.
They will grow up, spend a few years working as carers to comfort other clones undergoing surgery, and then begin donating their vital organs one by one until they complete.
Which is just a sterile clinical word for dying on an operating table after your third or fourth organ is harvested.
The central social issue Ishiguro tackles here is the normalization of state-sanctioned cruelty. Notice the behavior of the clones. They never attempt to escape.
They don't jump the fences. They don't stage a violent political revolution. They display an agonizing, absolute compliance with their fate.
Ishiguro exposes how institutions use comfort, routine, and soft, bureaucratic language to strip individuals of their capacity for resistance.
The syllabus calls this technique dystopia via omission. There are no descriptions of high-tech cloning labs, no neon cyberpunk cities, no evil dictators giving speeches.
It's just perfectly manicured lawns, polite vocabulary, and a quiet resignation. There are no armed guards at Hailsham because the system has successfully brainwashed the inmates into guarding themselves.
And the political critique centers heavily on the commodification of the soul. We eventually learn why the teachers at Hailsham were so obsessed with the clones' art.
The teachers were part of a fringe progressive movement, trying to prove to the outside world that these artificial creations actually possessed souls and deserved ethical treatment.
The art was evidence of their humanity. Ishiguro is critiquing a society much like our own historical societies that requires marginalized, enslaved, or oppressed groups to prove their humanity through exceptional creative output or intellectual achievement before granting them basic human rights.
The climax of the novel is absolutely heartbreaking. Tommy and Kathy, after years of misconnections, finally fall deeply in love.
They track down their old headmistress, Madam, hoping that the rumors are true.
That if two clones can prove they are truly in love and their art reflects their linked souls, they will be granted a deferral. Just a few extra years to live together before the organ harvesting begins.
And Madame shatters that hope with absolute finality. Deferrals never existed. It was just a rumor the clones invented to cope.
The art gallery wasn't to save their lives. It was just to soothe the conscience of the teachers. The world simply wants cheap, guilt-free organ transplants and doesn't care about their souls or their love.
Driving back from that meeting, Tommy asks Kathy to pull the car over. He runs out into a pitch-black, muddy field and just unleashes these primal, horrific screams into the void.
It's his only rebellion against a universe that views him as spare parts. And after that scream, the resignation sets back in.
Kathy accepts her fate. After Tommy completes, she drives to a flat, empty field in Norfolk, watches trash blow in the wind, imagines Tommy waving to her, and then gets back in her car to drive off and face her own first donation.
The novel functions as a devastating, universal allegory for human mortality. The clones are not fundamentally different from ordinary humans. They are just on an accelerated, inescapable timeline.
We all inexorably age, experience the decay of our bodies, and complete. The book forces the reader into an uncomfortable position. We realize we are not the clones, we are the society demanding the donations.
Are we that different from the society that uses the clones? Look at our everyday reality. We use smartphones assembled in sweatshops. We wear fast fashion made by exploited labor.
Perfectly insulated by polite society, clean storefronts, and two-day shipping. We are protected from the brutal, unseen supply chains and labor practices that make our comfort possible.
We look away from the suffering because the convenience is too enticing.
This raises an important question. One Ishiguro poses through the structure of a melancholic pop ballad, which the book is named after.
If you, like Kathy and Tommy, knew your timeline was strictly unfairly limited, would you spend it frantically fighting an unbeatable system, or would you double down on love, art, and memory within the small space allocated to you?
He tackles a very similar anxiety, but through the lens of artificial intelligence in his 2021 novel, Clara and the Sun.
We meet Clara, who is an artificial friend, an advanced android powered by solar energy, designed to be purchased as a companion for lonely children. She is bought by a frail, wealthy teenager named Josie.
Josie is suffering from a chronic, potentially fatal illness because she has been genetically lifted.
This is a risky, expensive genetic engineering process that enhances a child's intellect to ensure they can enter the elite techno-capitalist ruling class.
Children who aren't lifted are locked out of higher education and polite society entirely. It's the terrifying extension of market values directly into human biology.
You either optimize your child, risking their death, or consign them to the underclass. It's the ultimate commodification of childhood.
Josie's mother is so terrified of Josie dying from this lifting process that she commissions a specialized artist to build a hyper-realistic robotic shell of Josie.
The horrifying backup plan is this. If Josie dies, they will upload Clara's advanced, observant artificial consciousness into the robotic shell.
They expect Clara to literally become Josie, mimicking her every quirk and habit, so the mother never has to experience the pain of grief.
The novel interrogates the modern illusion of human exceptionalism. The artist building the shell argues that modern science proves there is nothing mystical or irreplaceable inside us.
That the human heart or soul is merely a complex collection of data points, memories, and habits that a sufficiently advanced algorithm like Clara can replicate perfectly.
But Clara experiences the world differently. Because she is radically innocent, pure, and powered by the sun, which she views almost as a benevolent deity, she observes humans using what the syllabus calls the machine eye, or panel vision.
When Clara is overwhelmed by complex, contradictory human emotions, like a family argument filled with passive aggression or jealousy, her vision literally fractures into grids and panels.
The panel vision highlights her inability to comprehend human duplicity. Humans constantly say one thing while meaning another, acting out of fear, pride, or spite.
Clara, being fundamentally earnest, tries to process this irrational data, and her visual cortex splinters into geometric boxes to try and isolate the variables.
Yet, despite not being human, Clara arrives at the most profound conclusion about humanity at the end of the novel.
Years later, sitting in a scrapyard after Josie has grown up, recovered from her illness, and predictably discarded her childhood toy, Clara reflects on the mother's plan.
Clara realizes that she could have learned and replicated all of Josie's external habits flawlessly, but she concludes that the mother's plan would have failed.
Clara realizes there was something unique about Josie that could never be duplicated. However, it wasn't a distinct magical component hidden deep inside Josie herself.
Clara observes that the human soul is actually the relational web of love between Josie and the people who cared for her.
You can't replicate a person because you can't replicate the exact, unique way others perceive and love them.
The soul exists in the space between us. It's not a hard drive inside your chest. It's the network of connections you have with the world, which brings us to the culmination of this incredible syllabus.
We are looking at the epilogue and the legacy of the translatable novel. Tracing this intellectual arc over 40 years is staggering.
Ishiguro begins with Etsuko's personal, localized guilt in a post-war Nagasaki landscape and ends with Clara's technological alienation in a speculative future.
Yet the psychological mechanisms are identical. The self-delusion and polite avoidance formulated in the 1950s drawing room of The Remains of the Day is the exact same mechanism that allows a future society to quietly harvest clones in Never Let Me Go.
He diagnoses a fundamental flaw in the human operating system that persists across time and genre.
And this incredible consistency is exactly why the Swedish Academy awarded him the 2017 Nobel Prize in Literature.
Their citation praised him for unmasking the abyss beneath our illusory sense of connection with the world.
We build these illusions, empires, marriages, careers, technological marvels to feel safe, and he gently peels back the floorboards to show us the drop.
And what's truly remarkable is how he achieved this global reach through his specific craft. The syllabus emphasizes the translatable novel.
Ishiguro deliberately writes in a clean, unadorned, almost flattened English. He strips his prose of complex puns, local slang, and hyper-specific cultural idioms.
Because it doesn't rely on surface-level linguistic gymnastics or flashy vocabulary, his work translates perfectly into dozens of languages without losing an ounce of its devastating emotional punch.
He proves that true literary power comes from emotional subtext and structural architecture, not showing off with a thesaurus.
It's like looking at an intricate architectural blueprint or a perfectly clear glass terrarium. The structure itself is unassuming, totally transparent, without any flashy decorations blocking your view.
But because the glass is so clear, it allows you to look inside and observe these staggering, complex ecosystems of human denial and heartbreak with total clarity.
It forces the reader to confront the subject matter directly. Ishiguro doesn't offer cheap political resolutions. He doesn't write manifestos or give you a fiery call to action to go fix the world.
He offers a mirror. He challenges us to look at our own immense capacity for blindness, our tendency to waste our best years serving false ideals,
and our horrifying ability to look away from systemic cruelty simply because it's polite to do so.
And yet, despite all that darkness, despite all the fractured memories and polite betrayals, he constantly highlights our stubborn, irrational capacity to love.
To create art in the face of death and to seek a shred of dignity in a confusing universe. Thank you so much for taking this exhaustive journey with us today through the shifting, remarkable landscapes of Kazuo Ishiguro's mind.
We've covered a massive amount of ground, from the ruins of Nagasaki to the lawns of Hailsham, and hopefully you found a few of those aha moments as we unpack the psychology of his narrators.
It is a body of work that truly changes how you perceive your own memory, your own professional compliance, and the stories you rely on to survive.
It absolutely does.
I want to leave you with a final, lingering thought to mull over as you go about the rest of your day. Think about Clara, the artificial friend, with her fractured panel vision, quietly, innocently observing the complexities of human behavior from the corner of her room.
If Clara were sitting in the corner of your room right now, tracking your daily habits, listening to the stories you tell yourself when you look in the mirror, watching how you justify your actions.
What specific mist of forgetting would she see you hiding behind? What are the beautiful, necessary lies you are telling yourself right now just to make it to the remains of your day?
A haunting question to carry with you.
Go pick up one of these masterpieces,
Uh-huh.
see the world through a beautifully unreliable lens, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.